So Thales was born in a place called Miletus, right? Um, and if you look at the map in the module, right, the map of ancient Greece in the module, one thing you'll notice is that ancient Greece doesn't just occupy modern day Greece. It's basically coastline. It's Greece, like modern Greece, plus the coastline of all the Mediterranean nations to the east of modern Greece, right? And this includes like Bulgaria and Croatia and Turkey, right? And other parts of Asia Minor too. But um, the important part is Miletus is in modern day Turkey, right? And keep that in mind because it becomes relevant later on. But big point, ancient Greece was a lot more spread out and still like has the same coastal aspect that's there in Grecian food. That's why Turkish food and Grecian food, coastal Turkish towns, um, and Bulgarian towns, there's a similarity in cuisine between them and Greek, in part. So Thales was born around 624 BCE, and he lived till about 545 BCE. Right? And he is known as the father of Western philosophy because, as far as we know, he's the first philosopher in Greece, in ancient Greek history. Right? And he was what was called a natural philosopher. I've mentioned this before, but natural philosophers were essentially the ancient equivalent of modern scientists. Right? They were concerned with nature, right? Using nature to explain philosophy. And this is a big step. Like, it doesn't seem it, but it's a huge deal because in ancient Greece to this point, it's the gods who are the embodiment of nature, right? The Olympians. Not our Olympians, but like the gods of Olympus, Olympians, right? Uh, if you wanted to know what lightning was, that was Zeus. Zeus through thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening. Scaramouche, Scaramouche, can you do the fandango? Um, what about earthquakes? All Poseidon, right? Well, what about who collects the souls of the dead and guards the afterlife? Oh, that's Hades, right? Both the location and the god, right? And so on and so forth, right? So the doing natural philosophy as the very first philosophical exercise is a major thing because it goes against the grain, right? He's investigating nature in a pseudo somewhat scientific way, right? And Thales begins with this question of what is everything made of, right? And this becomes pretty much the standard question with few exceptions for the pre-Socratics. This question of what is everything made of? And his answer is influenced by his environment, right? He lives in a coastal town of Miletus, so he lives by the sea. And so he sees water in all of its various shapes and forms, and this becomes his answer, right? And his justification for the idea that everything, all the world is made of water, comes from his noting of two types of change: qualitative change and quantitative change. Now, it may seem kind of straightforward, but qualitative change is change in quality, right? So the change in the states of matter. He boils water, he sees that it becomes steam, right? It's no longer a liquid. He freezes water, he sees it becomes ice. And then quantitative change is change in amount or quantity, right? And the same thing occurs. If you get a particularly heavy rain, the river will overflow and flood, right? And it can't do that unless it's gaining an amount from its normal state. Right? So he uses these two things to justify his idea that everything is made from water. In part because it's the most immediate example of these two types of change, right? And the most prominent. Um, and since it's the most prominent, it kind of lends itself to believing, right? If you didn't know any better, that means it should be that it's probably the base material that all reality is created from. Quick little sidebar here. Thales, as well as the majority of the philosophers who we'll be discussing this week, save for the last three, amongst the pre-Socratics, are what is known as monists, right? Their theories are a form of what's known as monism. And this just means that they believe that the universe reduces down to one base element, right? That everything reduces down to one thing that everything else is built from, right? So there's one fundamental substance to the universe, and everything else builds from that. All right. So that's not all that Thales did, though, right? Thales also made some rather important contributions outside of philosophy, right? That had practical application. Um, right? He had this idea that the Earth was a flat disk, or think of it like more as a frisbee, right? It's curved on one end, right? But it does have an edge. And this is something you have to understand is like the idea you get from grade school that people believe the Earth is flat is not the same as saying that the Earth, was like a sheet of paper or something, that it didn't have any curvature whatsoever. That's kind of a misnomer. Really, the idea was more that the Earth had an edge, right? That it wasn't a spheroid, right? Or an elliptoid, as it actually is, right? Um, so it's that there was some end to the Earth that you could fall off of, but that's not to say that there was no idea of curvature of the Earth, right? I mean, Thales, one of Thales' other major accomplishments is he calculated the heights of the pyramids using math and the curvature of the Earth, right? So the idea that the Earth is in a shape that has an edge is not the same as the idea that it is flat, right? For example, a cylinder like the water bottle, right, has two edges technically, right? One here, one over here. But it's clearly not flat. I mean, the whole thing is curved. So that's an important distinction, right? Um, people weren't nearly as primitive as like elementary and high school like to paint them as, like in their own thinking process. There were some things that were a lot more obvious to them than we give them credit for. Uh, Another thing that Thales did was he figured out that Ursa Minor, the constellation, basically the little bear. Now I want to go and watch Brother Bear. Damn it. Anyway, so Ursa Minor is one of the few fixed constellations in the northern hemisphere, right? Uh, if you're above a certain latitude in the northern hemisphere, you can see the full constellation, and it stays in roughly the same place across the year, right? Unlike the 12 zodiac signs that change throughout the year, Ursa Minor is in roughly the same place. I think it's northeastern part of the sky. So if you can find Ursa Minor, you can chart your course, right? This helped save a lot of sailors, right? Time, effort, and from getting lost at sea, right? Because the only other fixed constant that was known at the time was Polaris, the North Star, right? And if you're far enough north, Polaris is almost vertically above you and therefore doesn't actually do much for guiding you in a particular direction. Okay.